as educators and parents and leaders. We hope that what we share in these conversations will provide hope and energy to push for equity and create the conditions for positive change across education. I'm Junlei Lee. I'm the Saul Zaentz Senior Lecturer in Early Childhood Education and the co-chair of the Human Development and Education Program here at HGSE. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation where we will explore the power of resilience, not as kind of a magic cure-all, but instead as a way to build the skills and the systems we all need to face difficulty and fear and loss, and to take care of ourselves and the people around us. But first, I wanted to let you know that today's episode is being recorded and will be available to view on Harvard Education YouTube channel and Facebook page. And you can also visit hgse.me/ed now for recordings and information about future episodes. You can submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and you will also find closed caption access there. Now I'm excited to welcome my colleague, Rick Weisborg. He is the faculty director of the Human Development and Psychology Master's Program and the director of the Making Caring Common project. And also I wanted to welcome Dr. Lisa DeMoore, a clinical psychologist, New York Times bestselling author, and a CBS News contributor, and apparently a proud mom of two very funny daughters, and the author of a monthly adolescence column in the New York Times. Please join me in welcoming them. Lisa and Rick, I wanted to start by just asking both of you what you thought about resilience. I know there's often a misunderstanding that resilience, is like a gene or a trait or some natural born quality that's inside a person, that people are either resilient or they're not. I imagine that's not what you're thinking of and talking about when you mention resilience. Lisa, would you like to start?
Sure. And I'm thrilled to be with you today. Really honored to be with both of you. Okay, so resilience is something we've thought about, talked about, researched for a really long time, and then of course has taken on all new implications and meanings given what we as a world have been through in the last 14 months or still in. And I think how we frame it matters. One of the problems I was aware of prior to the pandemic that then became, I think, exacerbated by the pandemic was actually a misunderstanding of what mental health was. That I think there was sort of an operating definition of mental health that had somehow taken hold, that you're mentally healthy if you feel good, if you feel calm, you feel relaxed. And that is a definition no psychologist worth their salt would ever agree to. And part of how we can move towards the idea of resilience is if we start with the right definition of mental health. So here's my definition, and I think most psychologists would be on board with this. Mental health is when we have the right feeling at the right time. So if something awful happens, we are sad or upset, and we're able to weather that feeling effectively. So we have good coping. We know how to take care of ourselves through emotional difficulties. We know how to use our resources. That's resilience. Not that you don't suffer, not that you don't go through hard things, not that you don't have actually powerful emotional responses to difficulties. But when faced with emotional hardship, there is an awareness of what's involved with getting to the other side of it. There's a confidence that one can get to the other side of it. There's a knowledge of the resources one can draw on to get to the other side of it. To me, that's what resilience is. It is not about feeling good. It's about knowing what to do when things go wrong.
Thank you, Lisa, for emphasizing that point. It's about being able to feel appropriately given the situation, not just pretend to feel good. I certainly feel the impulse, I think, throughout the last year when friends and colleagues reach out and say, how are you? And my gut impulse is to say, I'm great, as opposed to, just admit, like, I'm terribly unfocused and I don't know how to focus myself. Rick, what do you think? What do you think about resilience?
Yeah, I'm with you about When people reach out now, I often say, well, I'm okay for my first pandemic. I'm doing okay. um, so I think what Lisa said, I think Lisa put it beautifully. I completely agree with what Lisa said. I would say a couple other things. I think people sometimes think of resilience as snapping back, like you are in a state that you're trying to return to revert to. And I think it's more appropriate to think about resilience as maturation and growth, as learning, as becoming wiser, as learning the subtle, tender, focused work of how to love people and how to love people well and how to love people in ways that are self-respecting as well. And I agree with you, Junlei, that you're about your point about, it being underscoring that this is not a permanent characteristic that we're talking about. There's a study that looks at well-being at 16 and 33. It's a longitudinal study, so it's tracking people from 16 to 33 and asking about their level of well-being. And it turns out there's probably a negative correlation between being happy at 16 and 33. And one reason is that athletic boys and attractive girls tend to be the most happy at 16 and among the least happy at 33. This is the revenge of the nerd study, by the way. But you need different coping strategies at 16 and 33. There are different sources of self-esteem at 16 and 33. These are very different developmental experiences. And I think we need to learn how to develop the wisdom and the relationship capacity to be prepared for different stages, different types of relationships and different developmental experiences. The final thing I will just say about it is I also think of resilience. I mean, one problem with resilience is that we should think about it as resistance as well. That, resilience is not about accepting or assimilating or reinforcing a status quo that is so unjust and so unfair to so many people. It's about resistance. It's about challenging unjust structures. And it's about resisting the many troubles in the world right now.
That's right. I think what I take away is this from both of you is that resilience isn't this inborn trait, right? It's this capacity in us that we can develop, but it's also the capacity in the system around us that creates space that allow us, for example, to have appropriate feelings and to be able to express it. And so, Rick, your last point, I think, of course, the uncertainties and challenges and the losses of the past year has hit everybody. But, a while ago, I think there was this poet who tweeted out this one verse. I think his name was Damien Barr, that echoed by a lot of people, which is that I heard that we're in the same boat, but it's not that we're in the same storm, but not in the same boat. And so this is a question for both of you, kind of over the last year. What have you seen as the effects of the pandemic on our individual as well as collective well-being, given just how different the experiences have been for so many people? And then how do we kind of express and understand our feelings with all of that? Lisa?
Sure. So, if we're talking about resilience, we're talking about stress, right? Because what you are trying to be resilient through or in the face of is stress. So we know a lot about stress. And what we know about stress is that it's impossible to say that any event, any happening is like X amount stressful, because how stressful it is entirely embedded in the context in which it occurs. Who does it land upon? What resources do they have at their disposal? So that idea of like, we're all in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat really lands. And I'll give you a couple examples. One way we think about stress is that it is correlated with adaptation. The more adaptation you have to do, the more stressful something is. Neither good nor bad, it's just the reality. My husband's a teacher. The amount of adaptation he has had to accomplish in order to do his job in the pandemic is tremendous. It is so hard to be a high school teacher in the pandemic. I mean, it's really hard to do your job that way, and yet he has. My job has often involved traveling to speak. My adaptation is now I stay home and speak. And so the pandemic in many ways has been quite a bit easier for me than for him, though we outwardly have all the same resources and all of the sort of same, available options for ourselves. So in that way, it's really different. Then we can think at the level of social groups. And one thing we have always known is that stress is a cumulative force. So we can think about the stress of the pandemic and how it is not evenly distributed. And we can think about it about what was there before, what has unfolded since. So this is simple and I know it, or oversimplified and I know it. If we think about pre-pandemic, let's say this is the baseline stress of being white in our society, and that this is the baseline stress of being non-white in our society. Then you put the pandemic on top of that. Then you put the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on top of that. We're not in the same boat. And I think that one of the things we want to be mindful of as we talk about stress and resilience is our own individual need to guard our resilience, cultivate our own resilience, and also thinking, this is my pandemic, this is my stress, this is my experience. I cannot make assumptions that I really know what it's like for other people.
Rick.
Yeah, no, I think again, I think Lisa put this very well. I mean, there are just huge differences, as you know, between groups based on class and race and culture and many other things that affected this experience of this pandemic. And when we talk about adversity, we really have to talk about these different levels of adversity that people are experiencing, different types of adversity. I mean, many communities, just everybody is going through grief and loss, and other communities, very few people are going through grief and loss. I think there are some things that have affected all of us. I think this has been for me, and I think a lot of people, it's been an existentially very destabilizing time. The pandemic has been existentially destabilizing, but also our political life and our moral life. That we had an insurrection. The temple of democracy was overrun. I really didn't want this to be partisan, but we had a corrupt president who's been fomenting a lie. I mean, these things. I think a lot of people in this country are existentially destabilized. We've had, several repeated police episodes, incidents of police violence against African Americans. So I think a lot of people in this country, for different reasons, are experiencing a kind of moral shock that the assumptions by which they were governing their lives and the level of trust doesn't exist anymore. Or it's been threatened in some way. And then we don't really have a vocabulary for talking about disillusionment or moral shock of the kind that I'm describing. And people on the right feel disillusionment too. They feel like the election was stolen from them. I mean, I don't think that's true, but they're in a kind of moral shock as well. So I think this is a profound existential and spiritual and moral moment for us as a country. And that part of what resilience is beginning to make these experiences we've gone through, as Aaron Antonovsky says, manageable and meaningful and comprehensible, coherent in some way, telling a story about them that makes sense and allows us to move forward.
Rick and Lisa, as I was listening to both of you talking about the different kinds of stress that we individually as well as collectively experience, I thought of the notion kind of in early childhood. We talked about kind of the difference between tolerable and toxic stress, right? And one of the things that makes the difference between what is tolerable and what becomes toxic is the presence of people around us that we can trust. And so I wanted to turn the conversation a little bit into kind of what can we as grown-ups, as parents and educators and clinicians do to support young people. I know in early childhood, I know how important young children's relationship with their families and caregivers are during this time of uncertainty. Mr. Rogers used to have this saying that he said the willingness and the courage to keep on trying develops best if there's someone we love close by who can lend us some of the strength we do not yet have within ourselves. So I know both of you think a lot about children as they grow up. So I'd love to hear kind of what you think as parents, as teachers and school leaders, we can support children, during school age, during adolescence, in these times. Rick, can we start with you?
Absolutely, Julian. I hope you are so thoughtful about these things. I hope you will share more of your wisdom about these things with us and with the audience. I think one thing we can do with teens is just listen. I know it may sound simple, but really listen to them and ask them questions and try and figure out, try and disentangle the things we're concerned about from the things they're concerned about. I mean, children of all ages, not just teens. trying to understand how they're interpreting and processing the world, the kind of worries that they have, the kind of hopes that they have. I think we need to help teams develop a range of coping strategies, and Lisa has written about this. I mean, a range of coping strategies that they can use flexibly, that there isn't any 100% solution. There are a range of ways to take care of yourself, and that for our own well-being and also for their well-being, we need to help them, and we need to help ourselves develop a range of ways of taking care of ourselves. I also am a big believer in activity, in taking action. I worry about passivity. When I say that there are things that are really fractured and wrong in the world right now, I mean, there always have been, but there seem to be especially glaring now. I think people need to take action, and kids often want to take action to do something about those things. And that's it's good for the world, and it's healing for them. I do a lot of voter registration work right now, and that's been healing for me. So, I mean, there are a lot of different kinds of action to take, but I think guiding kids and taking actions that make them feel like they're not passive and are being active and constructive is super helpful.
Thank you, Rick. Lisa, I want to turn the question to you, but I wanted to mention something that you said on one of the CBS morning shows that really struck a chord with me. You used this analogy about what happens when young children fell down, and how that relates to what we can do when we support teens. I won't butcher it, so I want you to tell that part if you could.
Sure. So the broad framing is we're trying to help kids come to terms with their feelings and be able to manage their feelings well. And the first step of that is they cannot be frightened of their feelings. And we as adults teach them how frightened they should or should not be of their feelings by how we react to their feelings. And so I'm going to start with the reality later in childhood, then I'll give the analogy that seemed to stick with you. So it's hard for young people, and especially teenagers, for whom feelings can feel really big, if the teenager's having a big feeling and then the parent seems to be bowled over by that big feeling as well, or rendered helpless in the face of that big feeling. That can take a teenager from feeling like, okay, this feels out of control to me, but it also seems to feel out of control to you. Now this is pretty scary. So what I encourage parents to try to do is to remember when we all were really good at this, which is when we were raising toddlers. So your toddler invariably falls down, skins their knee, and what toddlers always do is they look at their knee and then they look at your face. And they are going to read your face for how upset they should be. And if we are doing when we're on our A game and we're like, you're okay, come here, we'll clean it up, I got you. They're like, okay, fine. Even if you're thinking, this looks pretty bad. If we go, right? The kid goes, right? So our job as parents is to hold on to that memory that kids are looking to us for guidance about how upset to be about what just happened. And we don't want to minimize things. We don't want to downplay things. But we also want to try to not worsen the situation by giving the indication that it also feels out of control for us. I want to come back actually on the social stuff and the connection and having people around, because there's something about teenagers in particular, and actually even younger kids, that comes from the archives of clinical psychology that is really handy right now. So we have always known, always, we prove it over and over again, when it comes to social connection, quality beats quantity. We have proven this time and time again, right? People can look like they have large social groups, tons of social network, be very, very lonely. People can seem to have a very small network and be fine. So one of the things I'm managing right now is a lot of teenagers who are worried that they're doing it wrong, that they're not plugged in enough, that they seem to observe everybody else seems to somehow still be connected and I'm over here by myself. So I am finding it is very helpful for young people to say, look, you need quality, not quantity. And when we say quality, we actually mean three things. You need somebody to tell your worries to, someone to tell your secrets to, and someone or a group who helps you to feel connected and accepted. So as long as kids have those boxes checked, they should be all right. And it's really helpful for them to actually downsize it a little bit to concrete things. And then what Rick was saying about doing service, doing work in the name of social justice. If a kid wants to feel connected and accepted, that is a great place to start, to be of use to others. Really helps you find your people. And when kids are worrying about that right now, there's so much good to be done.
Thank you, Lisa and Rick. I think thank you for reminding all of us kind of how that we have the capacity to be good enough parents and teachers and counselors to the students in this particular time. I have just one more question for you before we turn to the questions coming from the audience. So in times like this, as young people look towards grown-ups, what is it that we can do to help the grown-ups, help the helpers in this particular case?
Yeah, so also, no, Junlei, I think and Lisa has talked about this already. I think you're totally right to move the conversation in this direction. There's a lot of concern about whether kids are going to be okay and weather this well. And by and large, and I want to just be realistic and positive, I think kids will be fine. I think by and large, kids are going to be there. They are resilient. They have lots of strengths. They're not going to lose their social skills completely. I think they're going to be fine. The cases that I worry about the most are when their caregivers aren't doing well, and the people close to them, the adults around them aren't doing well, or if there are fractures in those relationships. And so I think the question you're asking is so important about how adults can take care of themselves. And, some of what I think we've all said, I think pertains to adults too, that I think, when adults aren't passive, when they are engaged with the world, when they are taking on problems in their communities or in the larger society, when they are resisting when it's appropriate, is very important for kids to see. That adults need a range of coping strategies too. They need things that they can do to unwind and de-stress and feel good about themselves. And they need people to talk to when they have stress and difficulty in their relationships with each other and with their kids. They need to be able to reflect on that and need people who they trust and respect, who they can have conversations with. And Junlei, you've talked about one relationship. I think I think you're entirely right. It's really important for adults to have one relationship. Sorry, I'm going on too long because I know we got to stop, but we just collected this data on loneliness. Huge numbers of Americans are lonely, and that's a personal issue in a way, but it's also a societal issue. We got to do a much better job making sure that people connect to each other and reach out to people who are struggling and lonely too.
To go off of what Rick is saying, grown-ups do need to take care of themselves. And I think that where sometimes parents get stuck is they feel guilty or somehow feel like they're taking time off from parenting, and then they feel bad about it, and so then they don't do it. And what I would say is what we all know intuitively: kids learn far more from watching us than from listening to us tell them what to do. And so what I would say to any parent who's worried that they somehow feel guilty if they get a book and curl up on the couch, or if they say, I need to go for a walk by myself, is that they are actually teaching their children what healthy coping looks like by modeling healthy coping. And my favorite phrase in all of parenting, I learned on the inside of a chocolate wrapper: don't talk about it, be about it. So if you want your kid to take seriously the idea that they need to restore themselves, they need to take downtime, they need to be good to themselves, and they need to do so guiltlessly, you need to do that in front of them. So if you won't do it for yourself, do it so your kids see you doing it. Do it for them.
Thank you. I think what you just said reminded me of the phrase kind of attitudes are caught, not just taught. And this idea that we can be these models for the people around us. I'm going to turn to some of the questions coming in.
Junlei, can I say something super quick?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Super quick. It's just that I think that, I completely agree with Lisa about the importance of modeling, but I don't think we need to be perfect role models. I think we can be living, breathing, imperfect human beings and able to talk to our kids about that. And that's a very important thing to do. So I will stop there.
I completely agree. I think here's where we're striving to be the good enough parents as opposed to the perfect one.
And model for our kids how we talk about our flaws and our problems.
That's right.
Yeah.
I'm doing a really good job in my own form of modeling. My daughter's
right. So there a number of the questions that are coming in are hitting the same theme, which is when you're considering kind of all the stresses that's accumulated over the last year and a sense of a lack of hope, a lack of motivation and focus that many students are feeling. Do you have any suggestions for the kind of things that you think kind of any educator or even any parent out there could do to support their students during this gradual period of recovery?
I'll take it. I got a lot of thoughts. I'll go
Go ahead,
fast.
Lisa.
Okay. First of all, I feel cautious about narratives that suggest that this has been sort of a downtime or a year off, and everybody, when the pandemic ends, is going to feel revved up, ready to go. For me, the pandemic feels like an emotional marathon. We're going to get to the end of it, and then we're going to need to rest, and we're going to need to recover. And I think if people know that they will be allowed to recover, or they have the opportunity to recover, and I know this is not equally distributed in our society, I think getting to the end of the marathon will feel easier. I think it gets harder when there's this assumption that the marathon ends and then you're supposed to make up time over the summer or things like that. I also know the students I'm talking to right now, motivation, I have never seen it lower, and I had never seen it lower in October of this past school year, and it has just plummeted from there. One thing we can do is to normalize this for kids. The kids who are coming my way saying, I cannot focus on my schoolwork, seem so relieved when I say to them, nobody can. You are not broken. There is nothing wrong with you. I can't focus on my work, and I love my job, and I get paid to do my job, and it's my favorite subject. We're all really tired. And then I talk with them about the benefit of extrinsic motivators when your intrinsic motivators aren't working. I talk with them about using timers. I talk with them about rewarding themselves, and really try to help them understand we move between these two ways of getting work done. Intrinsic when we've got it, extrinsic when we need it. And to take the shame away from needing outside support sometimes to get things done.
I think Lisa had responded beautifully to this. We can move on, Junlei. I know there are a lot of other questions.
So this question is, I think, big, but incredibly important, which is that when we talk about all these things, all the support systems that are needed to help to buffer stress, help to promote resilience, when we go back to school, when we go back to the so-called normal, do we go back to the old normal or do we try to build a better system? Because it wasn't like that was a beautiful system in prior to the pandemic, helping young people coping with all these stresses to begin with.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about this one, so maybe I'll start with this one. I mean, I have the course I taught is called Innovation and Justice, and it's really about this theme. It's about there's going to be a tendency to try to take the first train back to normal in many places, to speed back to normal, and that would be tragic from my point of view. The normal was not working for huge numbers of students, and I think at every level. I mean, Junlei, you can speak to early childhood, but K to 12. Higher education, we should be rethinking these systems. We should be thinking just on this point of motivation. I know a lot of teachers who have learned quite a lot about how to motivate kids this year, and it's been very challenging. And their knowledge, their wisdom, their best practices about motivating kids should move forward. These inequities have always exist. They've been deepened. We have a moment now where we have public attention on really dealing with inequity in this country and thinking about what that means and what would it mean to center these institutions around equity in a very different way. Again, higher ed too. So anyway, I think this is absolutely a moment for innovation and moving forward. I think it's an opportunity to think about how to use online and remote learning in different ways too. So lots of people have access to great courses online, for example, in high school and middle school. I mean, there's a ton of different things that we could do that would be exciting and innovative and advance equity right now.
I'll add a small thing, totally just unique to being a clinical psychologist. The move to telehealth has been game-changing for a lot of families. And especially a lot of families where riding 3 buses to a clinical psychologist appointment made it prohibitive. So for some families, having internet access is a challenge, but for a lot of families, they have the internet access and they can access psychotherapy in a way they never have before. And I hope we keep it. And this is going to come down to state legislatures, and this is going to come down to insurance. But this is a dramatic shift in service provision that has actually made access better for so many. And I would be really sorry if we lost that.
Yeah.
That's right. Thank you.
Junlei, you guys wanted a quick thing?
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, just, I mentioned higher ed, and I also think this is a moment where, in particularly at highly selective colleges, where we're accepting 5 or 10% of people, we really should be getting status not from how few people we accept, but from how many people we educate. And we should be finding ways for less expensive pathways through higher ed that work for a lot of people, that are exciting and vibrant and more affordable and more attractive. And so higher ed, I think, really needs to move forward now too and innovate. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Well, I know we're approaching the end of our time, but I do have one more question for you, and that's coming from the audiences as well, which is to think about the kind of resources or tools and the kind of things that we can do, not only to support ourselves, but of course to support the people around us. I wanted to, Anne Masden, who's one of the lead researchers about resilience in our field from University of Minnesota, she wrote this terrific book called Ordinary Magic. And I love the word ordinary. And she talked about how the biggest surprise that comes out of the study of resilience across cultures and contexts and age groups was how ordinary the phenomenon was. That she talked about how most of the time the children, young people who make it ended up having ordinary human resources and protective factors in their lives. And somehow I've always found the word ordinary so reassuring that we don't all have to be, in Rick's term, to be perfect or to be superheroes in order to support the people around us. So this last question for both of you is, as we reemerge, recover, trying to build a better system, what might be some of the simple, ordinary practices or resources that we can turn to, even as we try to build a better system and support ourselves and support the people around us?
All right, I'm going to start with something that I know sounds corny, and yet we really blow past it, and it is so ordinary and it is so powerful, which is empathy. I am always amazed when a teenager comes my way and lays out something big and complex and messy, and I don't have the answer or I can't come up with it fast. When I just start, or when a parent just starts with, "That's awful, I'm so sorry," or "That stinks," or "That's a really difficult thing to go through," I am always staggered by how therapeutic that simple gesture is, and how often that's all the teenager wanted. With that empathy, with that connection, they can summon the resources they need. They can ask for the help that might be of use. But if you skip that step, you've hamstrung yourself right away. And if you do that step, you might have provided everything that's needed.
Yeah, Junlei, I'm a huge empathy fanatic, so I'm all for empathy. And you are too. I would just add that I think one big empathy challenge, and this is simple and complex, is that almost everybody has empathy for somebody. They tend to have empathy for people like them. In many ways, the empathy challenge is learning how to have empathy for people who are different from you in characteristics and background and race and class and culture and gender orientation. And a simple thing people can do is learn how to value and appreciate people who are different from them. And even people who may be off-putting in some ways. I think we would live in a much healthier community, a much better world, if we took care of each other in that way, and if we were willing to widen our circles of concern, our circles of care and concern.
Thank you, Lisa and Rick, for ending on this note of empathy. And I couldn't agree more. I think, and Rick, to your particular point, I think often it's within our capacity to extend that empathy. For example, for our children or close friends, it's much harder to do it with people that we vehemently disagree with. And you mentioned that earlier. And all this reminded me of this study not too long ago about how math teachers who were reminded of empathy, right, helped to reduce suspension rates in middle schools. And in that particular study, the teachers were reminded to do two things. One is something that we've talked about over and over again, which is to remember their relationship with the students, stories of relationship they had with students. But the other part was to imagine non-pejorative reasons for people's behaviors, to start everything not by assuming the worst of someone else, but to imagine what are the non-pejorative reasons and the benefits of the doubt to give to people that, you know, that may even make you angry.
Yeah, I love that. I would say something related, which is, something I find myself wanting to do with when I was a practicing psychologist, but also it's something I think it's important for teachers to do, is to see if you can identify 3 strengths in every student in your classroom and come up with a plan for working with those strengths. I mean, it's related to your point about not being non-pejorative. And take on the challenge of empathizing with the kid who irritates you the most and really ticks you off. That's a really important kid for you to connect with, and it's hard. So.
What I'd add is, one thing we know clinically, right? Wherever people land, they come by it honestly. What they're doing, they got there for a reason. And even that really irritating kid, whatever they're doing is working for them in some way. It might not be working in your classroom, but it's working for them somewhere.
It's their best effort to adapt, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. And so that, that posture that psychologists get to take of, in some ways, just being anthropologists, like, wow, why do you do this? How does this work for you? How did you come to learn this, right? Yeah. That stance towards even behavior that on its face is really off-putting, you can't get it wrong if you ask those questions.
And I think this point is particularly important in light of the fact that people have had such different struggles and experiences during the pandemic. And Lisa, you were saying earlier, none of us can assume that we know what another person went through over the last year. And so anyhow, I wanted to point to, again, Lisa's column on adolescence in the New York Times. Even though I focus on early childhood as a parent of teens, I read the columns and I felt that she was mapping the progression of my children during the last year. And I want to refer everyone also to Rick's project, Making Caring Common. And Rick, Lisa, it's just such a pleasure to have you here. And thank you, all of you who are watching, for joining us for this conversation. Stay in touch. And please check out the Education Now series and rewatch this as well as other episodes. Take care and stay well. And we hope that we all come together and build a much better system for our children, our families, and teachers all around. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Junlei. Bye, everybody.